He was the rich man nobody suspected, the friend everyone trusted, and the murderer nobody could catch. Whispers followed him from New York penthouses to Hollywood backstreets. 3 deaths, 3 victims, and one man who always walked away untouched. For decades, Robert Durst hid behind power, money, and a family empire worth billions. But then, a microphone he forgot he was wearing captured the one thing no detective ever could: a confession. A real-time unraveling of a killer's mind. This is the story of how a soft-spoken millionaire became one of America's darkest mysteries, and how his own words finally betrayed him. Welcome to Shadow Tales. Some stories begin with a crime. This one begins with a man. A man born into unimaginable wealth who somehow lived his entire life surrounded by death. His name was Robert Durst. To most of the world, the surname Durst meant power, skyscrapers, old money, and the kind of influence that never fades. But behind those polished Manhattan towers was a family secret, one that would follow Robert like a shadow he would spend decades running from. Because every time someone got too close to his truth, they disappeared. Tonight, we step into one of the strangest, most chilling true crime sagas in American history, a real-life mystery that spans 3 states, 3 victims, and over 30 years, ending in one of the most shocking confessions ever captured on camera. But to understand the monster Robert Durst became, we have to go back to where it all started. Robert was only 7 years old when he watched his mother step out onto the roof of their mansion. Moments later, she was gone. The official story said she fell. Robert always claimed he witnessed her jump. His brother Douglas insisted he was lying. This is where the fractures begin, where the truth splits in half and no one agrees on what really happened in the Durst family home. But trauma leaves fingerprints, and in Robert's case, those fingerprints would soon stain everything he touched. Fast forward to the 1980s. Robert is married to a young medical student named Kathleen McCormack, a beautiful 29-year-old woman who once believed she was marrying into a fairy tale. But friends say the marriage deteriorated quickly. The charming millionaire heir became jealous, controlling, erratic, whispers of arguments, bruises she tried to hide, late-night calls where she begged friends to come pick her up. Then one winter night in January 1982, Kathleen vanished. No body, no crime scene, no goodbye, just gone. Robert told police he dropped her at a train station. There was no evidence she ever got on the train. He refused to take a lie detector test, and the case quietly evaporated. Because in New York, the Durst name carried weight. Kathleen's friends begged police to look deeper. "Don't let this man get away with it," they pleaded. But he did, and for the next 2 decades, Robert Durst lived freely. Wealthy, untouchable. A ghost moving through the world, until another woman died. Her name was Susan Berman, Robert's closest friend, someone who knew all his secrets. Someone who once told friends, "If anything happens to me, look at Bobby." On Christmas Eve 2000, Susan was found in her Los Angeles home, shot in the back of the head execution style. No signs of forced entry, no signs of robbery. Police received a letter days earlier, cadaver, with Susan's address. The handwriting? Nearly identical to Robert Durst's. Still, he wasn't arrested. Not yet. Because Robert would slip away again. This time to Texas, where the nightmare would get even darker. This is the beginning of the story of Robert Durst, a man who walked through life like the rules didn't apply to him, a man wealthy enough to disappear, or at will, but disturbed enough to keep coming back. And as investigators would soon learn, you can outrun the law, but you can't outrun your own lies. Before the world ever heard the name Robert Durst whispered on television, before reporters searched his past and prosecutors chased his trail, there was one person who understood him better than anyone else. Her name was Susan Berman. To some, she was eccentric. To others, brilliant. But to Robert, she was loyal, unquestioning. The keeper of secrets no one else should ever hear. And that loyalty would cost Susan her life. Susan was the daughter of a notorious Las Vegas mobster. She grew up surrounded by whispers, money, violence, the unspoken rules of survival. These were lessons she carried with her into adulthood, lessons she would one day use to protect Robert Durst. Because in 1982, when Robert's wife Kathleen vanished, Susan didn't hesitate. She lied for him. She told police she had spoken to Kathleen, pretending to be her on the phone. She told friends, "Bobby needed me." A simple sentence, but one soaked in a kind of devotion that bordered on dangerous. For years, she kept Robert's secrets tightly locked, secrets that could have shattered his entire world. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And by the year 2000, investigators had reopened Kathleen's cold case. Who were they planning to interview? Susan Berman. And that was when everything changed. December 23rd, 2000, Los Angeles. Susan's neighbors noticed her dogs wandering outside, confused and hungry. Not unusual, they thought. Susan often forgot things. Susan often ran late. But then, her front door stayed shut. Lights remained on all night, and no one had seen her in days. When police entered the home, they found Susan lying on the floor, face down, shot once in the back of the head. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, nothing stolen. It looked like what investigators called a gangland execution, but this was no hit. This was personal. The killer had stood behind her, close enough to smell her perfume, close enough that she almost certainly knew who they were before the trigger was pulled. A few days earlier, the Beverly Hills Police Department received an envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. Cadaver. Below it, Susan's address. No name. No signature. Just that one chilling word. Detectives couldn't believe someone would be arrogant enough to mail a confession. But when they compared the handwriting to Robert Durst's, the resemblance was uncanny. Same slanted strokes, same uneven letters, same misspelling of the word Beverly. But once again, Robert vanished before the police could question him. He didn't flee the country. He didn't change his identity. Instead, he cut his hair, packed a small bag, and disappeared into the backroads of Galveston, Texas. A wealthy millionaire living in a cheap apartment, pretending to be a mute elderly woman. Why? Because Robert Durst wasn't just running. He was preparing for something. A new life, a new identity, and soon, a new body count. Because hiding wasn't enough anymore. And in Texas, the next chapter would unfold, one that even the most hardened investigators couldn't believe. A chapter involving a saw, trash bags, and a human body floating in the bay. Galveston, Texas, a quiet coastal town where nobody asks questions and nobody expects trouble. That's exactly why Robert Durst chose it. To the outside world, he vanished without a trace, but in Galveston, he didn't hide as a rich man or even as himself. He did something far stranger. He became Dorothy Siner, a mute, elderly woman who kept her head down, paid in cash, and never spoke to anyone. To the landlord, Dorothy was odd but harmless. To the neighbors, she was invisible. To Robert Durst, this disguise meant one thing: I can disappear completely. But even ghosts leave shadows. The apartment next door belonged to an elderly man named Morris Black. Lonely, irritable, always watching. People who lived in the building said Morris had a habit of staring out his window, observing everyone, especially Dorothy. He was suspicious. Too suspicious. And Robert noticed. October the 9th, 2001. In the calm morning light, a pair of fishermen spotted something floating in Galveston Bay. At first, they thought it was a discarded mannequin, the kind tourists left behind after a storm. But as their boat drifted closer, their faces drained of color. It wasn't plastic. It wasn't a toy. It was a human torso, neatly wrapped in garbage bags, cut clean at the arms and legs. Police divers recovered more bags from the water, arms, legs, and other remains. All but one thing: the head was missing. Without a head, there is no face. Without a face, identification becomes nearly impossible. Unless, of course, the killer makes a mistake. Inside one plastic bag, police found something unusual. A newspaper, soaked, torn, but readable. It wasn't from the current week. It wasn't local. It was from the exact neighborhood where Dorothy Siner lived. Detectives traced the address. When they knocked on apartment 221, Dorothy wasn't there. But the apartment told a story. The bathroom floor stained with water, a bone saw left behind, a trail of blood under a rug, poorly cleaned, garbage bags identical to the ones found in the bay. Then detectives learned something even stranger. Dorothy Siner had a bank account tied to Robert Durst. The runaway millionaire had resurfaced, hiding behind a wig, glasses, and silence. And suddenly, everything clicked. The torso belonged to Morris Black, the neighbor who watched too closely, the only person who suspected the truth. And now, Morris was dead, dismembered, and dumped into the bay piece by piece. Police found Durst days later in a local supermarket. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't armed. He was calmly pushing a shopping cart with a newspaper showing his own wanted photo sitting on top. Durst said nothing as they arrested him, not fear, not anger, just that blank, cold stare. During interrogation, detectives noticed something chilling. He didn't ask about bail. He didn't ask what they found. His only concern was this: did you find the head? They hadn't. They never did. And the reason would become clear later, when Robert told authorities exactly what happened in that apartment. A story so bizarre, so unsettling that even seasoned detectives didn't know whether to call it a confession or a performance. Because Robert Durst had a talent. He didn't just lie. He made people believe the lies were true. And what he said next would shape the rest of the investigation, shifting him from a suspect to something far more dangerous. A man who could kill and then convince the world it was self-defense. When investigators thought they had finally begun to untangle the bizarre contradictions surrounding Robert Durst, a new thread emerged. A thread that didn't lead to more confusion, but to a woman who had vanished decades earlier. Her name was Michelle Shelley Perry. And she was the beginning of a pattern no one had recognized until it was too late. 1982, Kathleen Durst had disappeared without a trace. For years, investigators focused on her marriage to Robert, the violent arguments, the injuries she confided about, the growing fear she expressed to her friends. But while they were chasing leads in New York, across the country, in Los Angeles, another woman vanished. Michelle Perry worked for a Hollywood production company, a vibrant young woman, sharp, ambitious, not easily intimidated. She lived only a few blocks away from Susan Berman, Robert Durst's closest friend and the woman who had acted for years as his personal protector. Michelle had no connection to Robert, at least not at first. But she had one thing that would make her dangerous to him. She knew Susan's secrets, and Susan knew everything about Robert. Detectives later reconstructed what likely happened. Michelle, while helping organize old files for Susan, stumbled across letters, notes, and recordings, material Susan had kept from her time helping Robert craft a narrative around Kathleen's disappearance. Not fabricated evidence, but carefully chosen omissions. The kind that protected Robert by keeping investigators looking in the wrong direction. Michelle didn't know the full story. She didn't need to. She had seen enough to start asking questions. Questions Susan didn't want to answer. Questions Robert Durst would never allow anyone to ask. And by 2000, as police began reopening the Kathleen Durst case, those buried secrets had become radioactive. Anyone connected to them was suddenly at risk. The disappearance no one talked about. Michelle Perry vanished in late 2000. No body, no crime scene, no witnesses, just a woman who suddenly stopped returning calls, stopped going to work, stopped existing. At first, no one connected Michelle to Robert Durst. She wasn't a friend. She wasn't a colleague. She was just a name. But when Susan Berman was executed in her home, only months later, shot behind the ear, execution style, investigators thought back to Michelle. Two women, both close to Susan, both disappearing at the precise moments Robert needed silence from anyone who knew too much. Patterns aren't always obvious in real time. Sometimes you only see the shape of the monster after enough shadows line up together. When detectives revisited Michelle's disappearance years later, they ran into the same problem that had plagued the Kathleen Durst investigation. There was no physical evidence, no body, no trace, no scene. Almost as if the architect of these disappearances had thought 3 moves ahead every time. But what truly caught investigators' attention wasn't what they found, it was what Robert did next. When asked about Michelle, he acted as if the name meant nothing. No reaction, no curiosity, not even the polite confusion most innocent people display when hearing about a vanished stranger. Just silence. Cold. Mechanical. Almost practiced. It was the same reaction he had when police confronted him about Kathleen. And later, about Susan. Like each disappearance was simply a loose end he had already tied up in his mind. The hidden pattern, as one investigator later said, it was only when we put the three women together, Kathleen, Michelle and Susan, that we realized this wasn't random, it was a system. A system of control. A system of silence. A system built to protect one man's secrets at any cost. Kathleen knew too much. Susan knew everything. Michelle learned enough. 3 women, 3 vanishings. And for the first time, detectives saw what they were really dealing with. Not a grieving husband. Not an eccentric millionaire. But a predator hiding in plain sight for decades. The only question now was how many more secrets had Robert Durst buried, and how many people had disappeared to keep them hidden. There are moments in true crime history where everything changes, not because of a witness, not because of a piece of evidence, but because the killer lets the truth slip out himself. For Robert Durst, that moment happened not in a courtroom, not during a police interrogation, but alone in a bathroom, speaking to a microphone he forgot he was wearing. The world would later call it the hot mic confession. In 2010, filmmaker Andrew Jarecki sat across from Robert Durst for a documentary interview. It was supposed to be just another meeting, polite, careful, almost sterile. But Durst was nervous. More than usual. Investigators had recently uncovered the cadaver note, a piece of evidence connecting him directly to the murder of Susan Berman. The handwriting matched his. The address was correct, and the spelling error, Beverly, was identical to other notes Durst had written. The walls were closing in. Still, Robert had agreed to speak on camera. Arrogance, narcissism, a belief he could outsmart everyone? No one truly knows. But the moment he stepped into that room, something changed. His foot jittered. His voice quivered. His eyes darted. Those cold reptilian eyes finally showing fear. And when Jarecki handed him copies of incriminating documents, Durst's hands shook. The mask wasn't slipping, it was cracking. The microphone that never turned off. After the interview ended, Durst went to the bathroom. He still had the wireless microphone clipped to his shirt. He didn't notice. No one reminded him. It recorded everything. As the door closed, Durst began mumbling to himself, a habit investigators said he'd had his entire life. Only this time, the entire world would hear it. He whispered,
"There it is. You're caught. What the hell did you do? Killed them all, of course."
The line that would shock America. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't accidental, it was spoken the way someone might comment on the weather, a quiet, resigned admission. Like a truth he'd carried for decades had finally slipped out. When the producers first listened to the footage, they froze. Was this a confession? Was it rambling? Was it evidence? Lawyers debated for days. Audio experts reviewed every second. Investigators crowded around speakers, headphones pressed tight. But one thing was clear. The voice on the recording was not a man pleading innocence. It was a man talking to himself, unaware that anyone was listening. Unfiltered, unmasked, unprotected, and for the first time in his life, Robert Durst told the truth. The documentary team turned the audio over to law enforcement. Detectives were stunned. One later said it wasn't just a confession, it was a window into how he thought and how easily killing came to him. When his documentary The Jinx aired its finale in 2015, millions watched in disbelief as Robert Durst confessed on national television. Within hours, police moved in. Durst was arrested in a New Orleans hotel with fake IDs, cash, and a map suggesting he planned to flee the country. The timing wasn't a coincidence. He knew the episode was airing. He knew the confession would expose him. He was running, but he didn't get far. This time, the past had finally caught him. For decades, Durst had manipulated everything: police, friends, the media, entire communities. He had dodged 3 disappearances. He had escaped suspicion. He had even been acquitted for a murder he admitted to committing simply because he convinced a jury it was self-defense. But one forgotten microphone destroyed the empire of lies he had built. Not a witness, not forensic science, not a detective's brilliant insight, just his own voice. Robert Durst died in prison in 2022, taking countless secrets with him. Kathleen's body was never found. Michelle's disappearance was never solved. Only circumstantial traces link him to the women who vanished around him. But that confession, those whispered words in an empty bathroom, will haunt true crime history forever. Killed them all. Of course. Was it arrogance? A slip of the tongue? Or the first honest thing he ever said? And most chilling of all, how many victims remain unknown? Robert Durst lived most of his life in the shadows, protected by money, silence, and fear. But in the end, it wasn't detectives or lawyers or investigators who exposed him. It was his own voice, whispering the truth he carried for decades. A confession caught not by force, but by fate. If you want more dark true crime stories, subscribe to Shadow Tales, because the shadows always have more to reveal.